So let's kick off with our first story. This is Mosaic ML. They've dropped MPT 30 billion. So this is their first commercially available open source LLM. This is trained also on 8,000 context length. Connor, tell us some more about this.
Yeah, this is an upgrade of their previous MPT-7B. This is now, of course, 30B. It's a jump from 7 billion parameters to 30 billion parameters. Very much mirrors how Llama has a 7B and a 30B. And this also very much mirrors Llama capability. But of course, the big difference here is that this is commercially usable where Llama is not. Another big jump here is that it was trained on an 8K it has an 8K context window. So while Llama can only take 2048 tokens, this can take 8,000 tokens like GPT-3 or GPT-4 can. So it's a very big jump, especially considering nowadays GPT-4 and GPT-3.5 can take up to 32,000 tokens of context. So open source finally catching up in that regard and being able to take 8,000 tokens of context. It's a very big jump for usability of APIs, of really any chat, of any platform whatsoever.
Yeah, the benchmarks and examples looked really good too. Farb, what do you think this is going to mean for the space? Do you think Llama is going to start moving to try to be commercially available even sooner? What does this mean for the space in general? Who can use this?
We've talked about Llama becoming commercially available. My money is on it becoming commercially available at some point here. There is just too much advantage for the folks at Meta to do, to not do that. I don't think this is going to, change what's happening in the open source world at a high level, in the sense that open source is just going to continue to plow forward. Will it make a practical difference? Sure, because it'll just be more options available to the open source world. And one of the things that people talk about is this battle between open source versus the closed operations that are doing this. And they're like, well, open source is still not anywhere close to what these other folks are doing. But how long has open source been at it? 2023, maybe like three months or something, 4 months. The pace of development in the open source world, it's tough to know what's obviously happening behind closed doors at DeepMind and OpenAI and Meta. But if it's any faster than what's happening in the open source world, I would kind of be shocked. So this is huge news for everybody. This sort of balance between the open source world and the closed source world is a true battle for the future of humanity. And whether or not we end up under the thumb of, two or three tech giants, or we live in a world where knowledge and information and probably the most powerful technology in human history is available to all or available to a few. So, this isn't ending anytime soon. We're just in the first few months of this. Imagine it, 5 years from now.
I mean,
Yeah,
we've seen Metas have the willingness to make commercially available models with things like image bind. They probably didn't do it with Llama because people, even with Llama being being available for non-commercial use, people attack them for like liability. But
Yeah.
now that 30B exists and now that Falcon 40B exists, Meta can say, well, Llama is pretty much equal to these other models out there. So they're not
absolutely.
allowed.
Mosaic also showed off their kind of enterprise inference and showing just how much cost savings they can drive for enterprises and startups compared to just hitting OpenAI's APIs. So really cool stuff out of Mosaic, and it's always amazing to see.
Yeah,
Our
one last Mosaic, they trained it, I think in an equivalent of $1.5 million for the base model, of course, but then their instruct and chat fine tunes only took like $1,000 each. And
Yeah.
it's all on their platform. All their data sets they use to fine tune is open source, and you can add on your own data. Very available to use for anybody, really. Mosaic's a great platform.
Base model and instruct are commercially available. Chat, not commercially available.
Correct.
Absolutely. Let's move on to our second story, which was Tesla had an amazing kind of tweet right here about them building foundation models for autonomous robots. So they covered how multimodal their networks are, taking in camera videos, maps, navigation. They covered some occupancy predictions. So a bunch of really cool videos giving a little bit more insight into what Tesla is doing for their foundation models. It's mostly targeted towards hiring, but or what do you think of this? Like, it's pretty cool what they're up to.
You know, it's kind of interesting because obviously this is nothing new at Tesla. They've been doing this stuff for years, but they're living in a different world now. That now they're living in a world where it might have been considered creepy or weird, or nobody cared if you were sharing this stuff, 12 months ago. But today you get all the kudos in the world from both the market itself, which is obviously hugely important to any public company, but also just the people, developers that want to work on projects like this. It's free marketing in a sense. One of the cool things that the model does is it's sort of ontologically agnostic. So what it's doing is it's predicting the likelihood of an object filling a space in 3 dimensions. Excuse me. It doesn't really care if the object is a cat or a house or a tree. It's trying to figure out whether or not there is going to be something that the robot could crash into somewhere in its 3D space, which means that they can, apply this broadly to lots of different situations, whether it's driving a car or a robot walking down a hallway. So that's a huge advantage for the folks at Tesla. They've been kind of building this from the ground up to be agnostic to the specifics of what's moving around, which kind of gives them a lot more options and directions to move in than other folks who are building, highly fine-tuned models on just one type of space.
Absolutely. Connor, anything notable you saw out of this? Like, do you think they're in a good position to actually tackle true robotics? They showed off their humanoid before. They're trying to hire some more engineers. What's your take on this?
I do. Like we talked about with Meta's computer vision papers from yesterday, a lot of this data applies to different types of models and different types of robotics. So as you said, Farb, all the like agnostic occupancy models that they're building using a lot of training and a lot of data from the entire fleet of Teslas around the world. That's training on a huge amount of compute to build very big models and very capable models. We see they're even building their own chipsets for training with their whole Dojo chips and their whole Dojo system of inference and training. So I think this will honestly apply very well from the Tesla cars to the Optimus robot.
Dojo supercomputer production is supposed to be hitting next month.
Yeah. Started in July 2023. So
I think they're in a really cool position to get some real robotics into the world, as they've been doing for the past decade. So really cool things out of them. And our last story of today is DeepMind's RoboCat. So RoboCat is right now just a paper, but they had some really interesting perspectives and ways of tackling robotics. So this is a foundation model for operating robotic arms, solves tasks in as few as 100 demonstrations. And the most important thing here was this really interesting feedback loop they had. So it actually improves from its own self-generated data. So it can, be fine-tuned on a task of, let's say, cooking a steak, and then it can refine-tune itself, learn, and generate new data in order to cook something else. So it had a really interesting feedback loop. Connor, tell us more about it. What did you take from it?
Yeah, the feedback loop you said, they have 5 different steps. So they do between 100 to 1,000 of a manual robotic arm trained by a human. And then they fine tune RoboCat on that task with that specific arm, with that specific agent. And then that agent practices again and again, 100,000 times for more training data. And then they take that final new data and the original data and put it into the original data set and then retrain RoboCat entirely. So that feedback loop is a very specific, very fine-tuned feedback loop that gives it a huge swath of new data without a lot of work from researchers. And because it's controlling just a robotic arm, they can also simulate that entirely. It speeds it up even more. Something we talked about yesterday with Meta's own robotic arm in their own training system. So very efficient and very amazing way they have to add new data to RoboCat. And then from there, they can also generalize it to specific different tasks of robotic arms. They can give it a new robotic arm and it can learn to go from 2 prongs of robotic arm to 3 prongs of a robotic arm. And it seems like a very capable model. So we'll see if any code comes out of it or if Google themselves, DeepMind themselves start using it. But from the paper or from their site, it seems like a very capable model.
Yeah, these simulated type of agents are extremely important in robotics because, of course, we're operating in the real world. So actually putting all these examples together, getting the lab set up, all of that has been such a length of time. And that's why robotics has lagged a bit. Barb, we've worked in the space and explored it for a long time now. What do you think of something like this? When you have these type of feedback loop, when you're taking these approaches, do you think we're going to see robotics move even faster?
Yeah, I think so. Our 2-prong advantage over the robot arms will slowly disappear. Not slowly, will quickly disappear. I think I'll get a little bit meta on this point because a lot of Meta, not the company, Meta, the general word. Most companies won't talk about this too openly. I've heard a little bit of it here and there, but we are already living in a world of absolute GPU compute scarcity. models like this that are, especially in a world where a model like this that's self-improving, you can imagine that there were no limits on the GPU processing that somebody like DeepMind could access, because as big as they are, as many computers as they have, they are limited by what they can apply that resource to at any given point. So if we were living in a world of unlimited GPU processing capabilities, this thing would be sitting there training itself 24 hours a day on a million different GPUs, and it would be so much further than it will actually be, because we are limited by GPU power. And this is happening at every company. This is happening. It's really the open source world, if anything, is really focused on trying to get more out of less. These big players are trying to get more out of more, but they can't really access the more. So the number one thing any nation or any company could be doing today that's in this space is figuring out how to get more GPU compute going. It will change the world faster than anything else will, probably in our lifetimes.
I think the more out of more and the more out of less is really the beautiful collaboration between these big players and the open source. Like we've seen, again, to bring up Meta, Big M, the company, we saw between Llama and GGML, they switched, Llama themselves, Facebook themselves switched from using the big originally trained Llama that's expensive to run to using GGML llama.cpp, which is very efficient and very resource efficient to run. So that collaboration we'll see with more models like this in the future. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. And if RoboCat can kind of lay the foundation that we have in the LLM world, which is a ton of text, if it can lay that same thing for a ton of simulated robotic environments, I think we're getting closer to a foundation model for robotics, which would be amazing. As always, what else are y'all seeing, Farb?
I'm looking forward to seeing a steel cage death match between Zuck and Musk, battle to the death. I'd love to really see them both in some hardcore like wrestling outfits,
Yeah.
and maybe do like a whole music intro type thing. It's going to be a fun time, even if they just keep talking about it and never man up and actually get in the cage with each other.
It's a call to action right there.
that's the goal. That's definitely cool.
Gar, what about you?
I saw that Disney's Secret Invasion, their new series on Disney Plus, their new Marvel series, actually used diffusion models for their opening credits. Looks very good. It's a very interesting effect, but it is very interesting how even just from that, just so recently, it already looks pretty dated. Considering the new Midjourney V4, V5, Stable Diffusion XL. So, as we've seen before, new technology and major releases, they can't really keep up. So,
absolutely. Yeah, I saw the Dropbox release Dropbox Dash, which is their kind of AI powered universal search. Pretty cool tool, but just in general, we touch on this all the time, but the speed at which these large enterprises are bringing AI into their products, Dropbox bringing universal search to enterprise. I bet you Microsoft SharePoint adds it soon. So always just interesting seeing the rapid pace of enterprise. They also launched a Dropbox AI fund. So I believe it's about 50 million. So good things out of Dropbox. But as always, thank you all for tuning into AI Daily, and we will see you again tomorrow.